Welcome back, bug friends. Today I wanted to go into another group for insect taxonomy and identification. Let's call this part officially part 22, the Embiidina or the embioptera. This is a group that you probably aren't going to see very much unless you live in the tropics. You might see them in the southern US, but unless you're in a very hot, very humid place, you're unlikely to see these. And these are called the web spinners. And this is an example here. But first, let's talk about where we're going, where we've been. So we talked about the Entonatha. We talked about the wingless insects. We talked about the Paleoptera, which are the insects with wings, but they can't fold them over the back of their body. And now we're into the Neoptera, which is the Embiidina are in this group. So we have the Neoptera, and they're also hemimetabolists. So they don't have complete metamorphosis. Metabolists. So we haven't talked about the Phasmatodea yet, and I'm holding off on that group because I have a book, a reference book coming in that won't be here for like another week or so. So I'm going to wait to talk about the Phasmatodea, and I'm just going to skip over them to their cousins, the Embiidina, or sometimes called the Embioptera. And these are the web spinners. They're a very small group, especially the ones that are here in the US, because they are limited environmentally to where they can live. It needs to be warm, it needs to be humid. So you're talking about things like the southern border and Florida and stuff like that. So getting into the cladistics of this, or the families and the phylogeny, this is specifically for the families in North America. So there aren't a ton. There are uh, definitely three families. The number of species is up for debate, I guess. I found a lot of different estimates for the number of genera and the number of species in the US, especially here in the Anasembiidae. Maybe two genera, maybe three species, maybe three genera, maybe two species. Basically, from what I've been able to read from this, the phylogenetics and cladistics and even some of the nomenclature of this group is a hot mess right now. And part of that is because this is a group that is very hard to identify and relatively hard to collect. So globally, there's 380 plus species and 100 plus genera and 13 families worldwide. In the US, there are definitely three families. The number of species is kind of up for debate. I've seen a couple estimates like maybe there's 11 species, maybe there's 9 species, maybe there's 13 species total. It's really just all over the place. Uh, so we're going to talk about all three of these families. I'll show you examples of them. They're not going to help you because this is not a family that can be identified just by looking at them, or looking at them casually from a casual observation, like you could do with some of the other groups. You will likely have to dissect out their mouth parts. You will likely have to get a male specimen with good intact wings to be able to do an identification, and you're going to need a pretty good microscope. So we'll talk about them, but if as long as you can identify this group as Embiidina or Embioptera, both of these names I've seen in use. I don't know what the correct one is. I learned this as Embiidina. Embioptera makes more sense as far as standardized nomenclature, but most entomologists will recognize, whichever one you use, they'll recognize what you're talking about. So just kind of in general, what can you say about these guys? So they're small. They're very small, generally between 4 and 20 millimeters, so a couple centimeters at most. They are mostly tropical, enjoy humidity, so you're going to need to be in the warmer parts of the US. You're not really going to find these in Canada. They tend to be herbivorous, but mostly towards like dead plant matter or fungus or lichens or moss. Like they tend to nibble on smaller things. They're not out there hunting. They're not taking down, eating large plants. They're pretty fragile overall. They tend to live in colonies, and they pretty much never leave those colonies unless it's for mating. Um, they make these colonies out of silk, and they have these forelegs, these swollen forelegs here, the tarsi, which they can use to produce silk, and they're the only insect which are capable of producing silk out of their legs. And this is where they get the name web spinners, because they use these silk glands to produce silk galleries for their colonies. And their colonies tend to be underground or under rocks or under bark, leaf litter. They will conceal the colonies. They live colonially, and then they work together to produce these silken tunnels. They very rarely leave these tunnels unless they are leaving for mating, and it's usually the males that leave. They do have maternal care for the young within these silken tunnels that they spin, so they are considered kind of subsocial, not as social as something like the termites, but they do work together, they live together, and they will care for their young somewhat. Embioptera tend to look like this example here. They are small, they are various shades of brown or black. Their antennae are these slender, beaded filiform structures, and they are frequently wingless. So the wings are only present in adult males some of the time. And this is what makes them very difficult to identify, because you need the wings to identify most of the families. Their wings tend to be highly flexible. They tend to be kind of a smoky brown gray. And when they're present, do I have one? So yeah, so you can see here kind of the smoky color. And kind of strangely, this is what the wings of the male look like when they're about to take flight. When these guys are not flying, their wings actually shrivel up. So their wings are held in a flight readiness through hydraulic pressure of the hemolymph. So when they're not flying, the wings are small, just kind of like shriveled up on their back, and then they pump blood into them to make them erect, basically, and they fly like that. They have to actively pump blood into them. And then when they're done with all their flights, the wings shrivel back up. And this is because they live in these tunnels. They have to be evolved for tunnel life, which is also why they have these pronathous mouthparts that point forward. Generally, you only see that in predaceous insects. These guys are not predaceous. The reason that they point forward is because they can't move their head very much when they're in their tunnels. Other things that they can do is they can actually fold their wings up over their head so that they can run backwards through their tunnels. So their name Embioptera or Embiidina comes from embios, which means lively, and it's because they can run really, really fast. They have very strong hind legs. Sorry, these are the hind legs here. And they have these big thighs that you can see back here. And the reason for that is because they run really, really well. They're not great flyers, but they are good runners. So they are adapted heavily for this sort of tunnel life. So their mouth parts are manipulate. They do chew, and I can show you some sketches of their mouth parts here in a second. The males tend to be more flattened, and the females tend to be more cylindrical. Their tarsi are three-segmented. The basal segment is greatly enlarged for their web spinning behaviors. And like I said before, this is the only insect that can do this, that can spin webs from their forearms, and it's kind of considered an evolutionary dead end. This is a very small group. They never really proliferated. And this is not like a lot of these weird adaptations that they have. You don't see this in any other insect group. They're not considered, highly successful. And then their cerci on their back are two-segmented, so back here. And in the males, these cerci are sometimes asymmetrical, so it'll be two on one side, one on the other. I have no idea why it's like that. So for reproduction, it's the adult males that generally leave because they have the wings. So they will fly over to some other colony in order to mate. If the males don't have wings, then they have to crawl to another colony, which means that in a local area, the populations are frequently inbred. But besides that, they just don't go anywhere. So they can be very hard to collect. Sometimes you can get the males coming to lights if they're out flying, but it's not like other insects where they're just flitting about all the time. In fact, I've only ever collected one of these in real life, and it was while I was living in the Caribbean. They just don't show up very much. So the issue with the Embiidina is because you need generally you need a specimen with wings. It makes the females basically impossible to identify. and it makes the juveniles impossible to identify. So you really need an adult male with wings, and even if you have an adult male with wings, they're not easy to identify. And I have a key here for the Embioptera. It's a phylogenetic key, or it's a phylogenetic tree with classification and a dichotomous key in it. That's pretty useful and I've used for part of this. I will link that in the description if any of you are interested in looking at the Embioptera in more detail, or if you have some or anything like that. Although, if you do have some, you're kind of a rare collector that has them. So there's three groups, like I talked about. There's the Anasembiids, the Oligotomids, and the Tetratembiids. So for the first group, the Anasembiids, here, they are identifiable partially by their mandibles. And this is what I mean by you're going to have to cut out their mouth parts. So how you would identify an Anasembiid going through the key, what differentiates them from the other Embiidina? These are their mandibles here. And they are sickle shaped. You can see this hard sickle shape. And there's no teeth, and it's one apical pointed end. And that is unlike these other two groups that you will collect in North America. So for the Oligotomidae and the Tetratembiids, their mandibles are different. They're not sickle shaped, they're more robust and blunt, and they don't come to a point, and they have teeth. So if you were to do a comparison, it would be, and they would have internal teeth here. So you would have two different, very different shaped mandibles. So you would have to cut those out. So this would be an Anasembiid. This would be a wingless adult. Whereas with the Oligotomids, again, they're frequently wingless. You cannot identify these wingless adults, and there's not much to look at. So if you collect an Embiidid, you might, or an Embioptera, you might just leave it at that. I don't like. I wouldn't try to do an identification of these unless I had really good tools, a really good microscope, and a little practice. And then the Tetratembiids, the way that you tell the Oligotembiids or the Oligotomids and the Tetratembiids apart is you need a winged male. And the difference that you'll see in this is neither of them, but you will need to have this a wing, and you will have to find the RA vein, MA vein, so median anterior. And in the Oligotomids, it'll be a straight line like you see here. How does this look? It'll be a straight line like you see here. And in the Tetratembiids, it'll be forked. And that's what the difference that you will find in the key. So not a lot to help you with the identification of this group. Again, their identification is very difficult. It's kind of all over the place right now as far as, which species are which. I don't envy you if you're going to try to do an identification of this group. But that's really all I wanted to talk about today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. As soon as I get my Phasmid book in, the walking stick book, I'll be talking about those guys. And I'll see you then. Bye.